As I mentioned in the previous video, it is impossible to produce a perfectly accurate account of the historical Socrates, as it is hard to say at what point in Plato's own dialogues the character Socrates becomes a mere mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas. The Gorgias is a fairly early dialogue in which Plato set forth most of his central problems of ethics. In the Meno and the Phaedo, Plato constructs the basis of his metaphysics, and in the Republic he furthers the ideas set forth in the Gorgias. The Gorgias contain 3 sections, each having a different interrogator for Socrates. The first part is out to dispose certain claims of rhetoric. Gorgias, a first-generation sophist, himself upholds that rhetoric, as the art of persuasion, is the means to man's supreme good, which is freedom to have one's own way in everything. In the city-state, this means to be able to sway one's fellow citizens to one's own benefit. To dispute this, Socrates first sets out to distinguish the kind of persuasion which produces knowledge in the man who is persuaded, which consists of reasons for believing something, and the kind of persuasion that does not, consisting of psychological pressure. Gorgias accepts that his rhetoric is the latter kind, and asserts that it is morally neutral, able to being used for right purposes or for wrong purposes. But in order for Gorgias to hold that persuasion is morally neutral, he must also hold that it is morally irrelevant whether a man comes to a given belief by reasoning or in some non-rational way. And further, that a man's exercise of his own rationality is irrelevant to his standing as a moral agent. This willingness to assume a whole philosophical psychology is one of the more regressive features of sophists like Gorgias. At this point, Gorgias is replaced by his pupil Polus, who reiterates that a man can do whatever he wants if he is a successful orator, since rhetoric is about gaining power. Socrates responds to this by stating that a man may do what he thinks is good for him, while not doing what he desires or what is actually good for him. That a man who is happy to gain power by conquering others is only happy through a mistake on his own part as to what is good for him. For Socrates, it is worse for a man to inflict wrong than to suffer wrong himself. Polus is not prepared to accept this, but he does accept that it is more disgraceful. Yet Polus also agrees that in order to be the Athenian ideal of a gentleman, one must be both honourable and thought of as honourable. And so Socrates is now able to demonstrate that honour and goodness, and disgrace and badness cannot be distinct from one another. If to suffer is more honourable than to make others suffer, then it is because it is better and more beneficial to suffer. Socrates' next interlocutor, Callicles, asserts that the supreme good is to satisfy all desires, which contradicts Socrates in 2 ways. Firstly, Callicles believes that the desires of man can be fully satisfied, and secondly, that the greater the desires, the greater the satisfaction. Furthermore, Callicles believes that the strong man has the right to rule, but Socrates points out that the populace are obviously stronger than the tyrant, and so they should rule, forcing Callicles to redefine strong to mean more intelligent. Socrates moves on by stating that the good-bad dichotomy is not equitable to the pleasure-pain dichotomy, as the first is mutually exclusive while the second is not. Callicles accepts this distinction since he believes that bad men often feel more pleasure than good men. Socrates argues from this point that the concept of goodness must be related to the idea and practice of limiting one's desires in such a way that our actions will always have some property by which we can distinguish them from other actions. In other words, all of our desires can only be specified as good by specifying the rules which would govern the behaviour required for that particular desired outcome. In summary, the first notable conclusion made in the Gorgias is that a desire is only satisfiable if it is given a specified object where there is a particular goal to be pursued. The second is that if anything is to be a good thing, which is to say, a possible object of desire, it must be specifiable in terms of some set of rules which might govern behaviour towards it. To do whatever one wants is fruitless, since such a man would no longer be an intelligible agent in human society. And finally, badness consists in breaching a form of life in which certain goods can be attained, where a form of life is one in which various concepts are shared between individuals. What a bad man lacks is this ability to share a common form of life. The next step in specifying what is good is therefore to determine what kind of common life is necessary for good to be realised. This is the task of the Republic.